Callers who asked 911 for help, but the operator thought you were lying. What was happening? I was driving back from my sister's place in Harrisburg when I saw the silver Subaru lose control 3 cars ahead of me on Route 81. The rear end fishtailed twice, then the whole vehicle spun sideways before slamming through the guardrail. The sound of metal tearing cut through everything. I watched the car flip once before it disappeared over the edge into the ravine below, and my foot was already slamming on the brakes. My truck skidded to a stop on the shoulder and I was dialing 911 before I even unbuckled my seatbelt. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, asking me to state my emergency, and I was already talking over her about the accident, the car going over, the family inside. She asked me to slow down, but all I could see was that Subaru spinning through the air with people inside, and I kept thinking about how far down that ravine went, about the creek at the bottom that ran fast this time of year. I gave her the mile marker, 167 northbound, right past the exit for Jonestown, told her it was a silver Subaru Outback, newer model, Pennsylvania plates. She put me on hold for maybe 15 seconds while she checked something, and when she came back her voice had changed, gotten more skeptical. She told me she wasn't seeing anything on the traffic cameras, no debris on the road, no reports from other drivers. I felt frustration burn through my chest because I'd watched it happen right in front of me, watched that car tear through the guardrail and disappear. I told her I was positive that there were people down there who needed help right now, and she asked if I'd been drinking or if I was on any medications that might affect my judgment. That question hit me like a slap. I told her no, I was completely sober, and there was a real emergency happening while we were wasting time. She said she'd dispatched a unit to check it out, but her tone made it clear she thought I was lying or confused. When I asked how long until they arrived, she said 15 to 20 minutes depending on where the nearest patrol was. I hung up and stood on the shoulder while cars whipped past at 70 miles per hour. I could see the torn guardrail about 50 yards ahead, the metal twisted and bent outward with fresh scrape marks gleaming in the sun. I started walking toward it. When I reached the gap, I looked over the edge and felt my stomach drop. The ravine was steep, maybe a 60-foot drop down a rocky slope covered in brush before it leveled out near the creek. I could see the Subaru down there, upside down in the shallow water, the undercarriage facing up, and all 4 wheels still spinning slowly. The creek was running high and fast, churning white around the wreck. I couldn't see any movement from inside the car. I called 911 again and got a different dispatcher this time, a man who sounded younger. I explained the situation all over again, told him about the torn guardrail, about seeing the car down in the ravine right now, about how it was partially submerged and nobody was getting out. He put me on hold and I could hear him talking to someone in the background, saying something about a previous call about this location. When he came back, he told me they had a unit en route, but there was some confusion because the cameras weren't showing anything. He explained that the highway camera system had experienced a technical issue around the time I'd called, some kind of data corruption that wiped about 8 minutes of footage. I stood there on the shoulder, holding my phone so tight my knuckles hurt, and I realized they still didn't believe me. They thought I was either mistaken or making this up, despite the destroyed guardrail right in front of me, despite my repeated calls, despite the fact that every second we wasted was another second those people were trapped down there. The dispatcher was still talking, saying something about how they'd have someone there soon to assess, and I cut him off and told him I was going down there myself. He started to protest, telling me to stay back, wait for emergency services, but I was already hanging up and looking for a way down that slope. The embankment was steeper than it looked from the road. I started down sideways, grabbing at small trees and bushes to keep from sliding, my work boots slipping on loose dirt and rocks. About 20 feet down, I lost my grip and slid another 10 feet on my side, branches whipping at my face, before I caught myself on a bigger tree trunk. My ribs hurt where I'd hit something on the way down, but I kept moving. The sound of the creek got louder as I descended, that rushing water sound that meant it was moving fast and deep. When I finally reached the bottom, my jeans were torn and I could feel blood running down my arm from somewhere, but I didn't care. The Subaru was worse up close. The entire roof was crushed inward from the impact, driver's side submerged deeper than the passenger side, water pouring in through the broken windows. I could see someone in the driver's seat, a woman, her hair floating in the water that filled the front compartment. I splashed into the creek and the cold hit me like a punch, water up to my thighs, current trying to pull my feet out from under me. I grabbed the car frame to steady myself and looked inside. The woman wasn't moving. Next to her, a man in the passenger seat was also underwater, his eyes closed. In the back, I could see 2 car seats, both still strapped in. One was empty, the harness unbuckled and hanging loose. In the other was a little girl, maybe 4 years old, crying and screaming, her face red and terrified. The water was rising. I could see it climbing up the side of the car, already past the bottom of the rear windows. The little girl was still above the waterline, but not for long. I tried the rear door, but it wouldn't budge, jammed from the impact, or maybe bent shut. I moved around to the other side, water pulling at me, rocks slippery under my boots. That door was partially open, wedged against a boulder, with maybe 8 inches of space. I pulled at it with everything I had, my boots losing purchase on the creek bed. and it moved another few inches, enough to get my arm through. I reached in and found the little girl's car seat buckle, my fingers fumbling with the mechanism while she screamed in my ear. The buckle finally clicked and released, and I pulled her toward me, her small body sliding out of the straps. I had to turn her sideways to fit through the gap, her shoulder catching on the doorframe, and she was crying harder now, saying "Mama" over and over. I got her through and lifted her up out of the water, holding her against my chest. She was soaking wet and shaking, her arms wrapped around my neck so tight I could barely breathe. I looked back at the front seats. The water was up to the woman's chin now, her head tilted back at an angle that made my stomach turn. The man next to her had blood running from his temple into the water, turning it pink around his face. I couldn't tell if either of them was breathing. The empty car seat in the back meant there had been another child, and I scanned the creek frantically, looking downstream, looking at the banks, my heart hammering in my chest. The current was strong here, faster than I'd realized. If a child had been thrown clear during the crash or had gotten out somehow, the water could have carried them 50 yards or more already. I started moving downstream, still holding the little girl, fighting against the current and the rocks under my feet. The creek bent around a cluster of large boulders about 30 yards down, and I could hear something over the sound of rushing water. A different sound, higher pitched. I moved faster, nearly falling twice, the little girl crying against my shoulder. When I got around the boulder cluster, I saw him, a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, clinging to a fallen tree branch that hung out over the water. His head was barely above the surface, his arms wrapped around the branch, his face white with cold and terror. I waded toward him, the water getting deeper, up to my waist now, the current stronger in this section. The little girl was crying louder, saying something about her brother, and I told her to hold on tight to me. I reached the boy and grabbed his arm, trying to pull him toward me, but his hands were locked around that branch like he'd been frozen there. I had to pry his fingers loose one at a time while the current tried to rip both of us downstream. When I finally got him free, he grabbed onto me with both arms, and suddenly, I was trying to keep 2 kids above water while my boots slipped on the creek bed and the current pulled at all of us. I turned back toward the shore, moving at an angle against the flow, each step a fight to stay upright. The boy was heavier than the girl, and he'd gone limp, either from exhaustion or shock, his full weight dragging on my left side while she clung to my right. My foot caught on something underwater, and I went down to one knee, water surging up to my chest, and I had to use every bit of strength I had to push back up. The shore was only 10 feet away, but it felt like a mile. I took another step, then another, and finally, my boots hit solid ground instead of slippery rocks. I dragged us up onto the muddy bank and collapsed, both kids still in my arms. The girl was still crying, but the boy wasn't making any sound. I laid him down on his side, and he coughed up creek water, then sucked in a gasping breath that turned into more coughing. His lips were blue, and he was shaking violently, but he was breathing. I pulled out my phone, somehow still in my pocket. The screen cracked, but still working. I dialed 911 for the 3rd time. A woman answered, different from the first dispatcher, and I didn't wait for her to finish her greeting before I was talking. I told her there were 2 children here with me, hypothermic and in shock, 2 adults still trapped in the car underwater, and if they didn't get someone here in the next few minutes, those adults were going to die if they weren't dead already. I gave her the same mile marker, the same location, and I could hear the confusion in her voice when she said they'd already had calls about this location, but units were reporting no accident visible from the road. I started yelling then. I couldn't help it. Told her I didn't care what the cameras showed or what the units saw from the road. I was standing here at the bottom of the ravine with 2 kids I'd just pulled from the creek and 2 adults drowning in a car right now. She put me on hold. I sat there on the muddy bank with 2 terrified children, one barely conscious. My phone pressed to my ear while I waited for her to come back. The girl had stopped crying and was just staring at the water, her lips moving like she was talking to someone I couldn't see. The boy's eyes were closed, but he was still breathing, still shaking. When the dispatcher came back, her voice had changed, urgent now, and she said they were sending paramedics and fire rescue to my location, but I needed to stay on the line and tell her exactly where I was, because the GPS was showing me near the highway, but they couldn't see how to access the ravine. I described the torn guardrail, told her to look for my truck on the shoulder with the hazards on, told her the slope down was steep but manageable if they had rope. She asked about the adults in the car, and I looked back toward the Subaru. The water was higher now, completely covering the front windows. I couldn't see inside anymore. I told her I didn't know, that I couldn't get to them, that they needed someone with equipment to pry the doors open. She kept me on the phone asking questions about the children's conditions, and I answered as best I could while trying to keep the boy awake and the girl from going into shock. It felt like hours, but was probably only 8 or 9 minutes before I heard sirens above. Multiple vehicles, the sounds overlapping and echoing down into the ravine. I heard voices shouting, saw movement at the top of the slope, and then firefighters were rappelling down, 4 of them in full gear with equipment. The first one to reach me was a woman with short gray hair who immediately went to the children, checking their vitals while asking me rapid-fire questions about how long they'd been in the water, whether they'd lost consciousness, if I'd seen any injuries. I answered what I could while pointing back at the Subaru, telling her about the 2 adults still inside. 2 of the firefighters were already moving toward the car, carrying cutting tools and a rescue basket. The other stayed with the children, wrapping them in thermal blankets that had appeared from somewhere, talking to them in that calm voice emergency workers learn. The woman asked me my name, and I realized I couldn't remember if I'd told the dispatcher. "David?" I said. "David Brennan." She nodded and told me I'd done good, that I'd saved these kids' lives, but I couldn't stop watching the firefighters at the car, couldn't stop thinking about those parents underwater while I'd been getting the children to safety. They had cutting equipment out now, some kind of hydraulic tool that screamed as it bit into the car's frame. One firefighter was in the water up to his chest, reaching into the driver's window, and I saw him shake his head. The other one moved to the passenger side, and after a moment he shook his head too. They worked anyway, cutting the doors open, pulling the bodies out, laying them on the muddy bank. One of them started CPR on the woman, while the other worked on the man, their movements efficient and practiced, but I could see in their faces they knew it was too late. More paramedics arrived, sliding down the slope with a litter, and they loaded the boy first because he was less responsive. The girl started screaming when they tried to separate her from her brother, so they let her ride up in the litter with him, both of them strapped in while the firefighters hauled them up the slope using ropes. I watched them disappear over the top, heard the ambulance doors slam, heard the sirens start up again. The firefighters were still working on the parents, switching out who did compressions, one of them talking into a radio, but their movements were getting slower, less urgent. The woman firefighter came over to me and said I needed to get checked out too, that I was probably hypothermic myself, and that cut on my arm needed stitches. I looked down and saw she was right. There was a gash on my forearm I didn't remember getting. Blood, mixing with creek water and mud. She started leading me toward the slope where they'd set up a rope system, and I let her, my legs shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Behind us, the firefighters stopped CPR. One of them looked at his watch and said something into his radio, and they both just stood there for a moment before starting to prepare the bodies for transport. The climb up the slope was harder than coming down had been. My muscles felt like water, and I kept slipping, having to rely on the rope and the firefighter guiding me from above. When I finally reached the top, there were police cars and fire trucks everywhere, lights flashing, blocking 2 lanes of traffic. An ambulance was still there, rear doors open, and a paramedic grabbed me immediately and guided me to sit on the back bumper. He wrapped another thermal blanket around my shoulders and started examining my arm while asking the same questions everyone else had asked. How long was I in the water? Did I lose consciousness at any point? Was I having any chest pain or difficulty breathing? A state trooper approached, a tall guy with a thick mustache holding a notebook. He asked if I was the one who'd made the initial 911 calls, and I nodded. He wanted to know exactly what I'd seen from the beginning, and I went through it all again while the paramedic cleaned and bandaged my arm. The trooper's face got tighter as I talked, especially when I mentioned the dispatcher not believing me, asking if I'd been drinking, the delay before anyone was sent. He wrote everything down, asked for my contact information, told me I'd need to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. Another ambulance was pulling away, no sirens this time, just lights, and I knew that meant the parents. The trooper saw me watching and said the children were being taken to Hershey Medical Center, that they were stable but would need to be monitored for hypothermia and shock. He asked if I knew their names, and I realized I didn't. I'd pulled 2 kids from a creek and held them while they cried, and I didn't even know what to call them. The trooper said they'd identified the family from the vehicle registration. Jeffrey and Diana Ashford, their daughter Lily, who was 4, and their son Nathan, who was 8. Jeffrey had been pronounced dead at the scene. Diana had a pulse when they pulled her out, but it was weak, and the trooper's expression told me what he thought her chances were. The paramedic finished with my arm and said I needed to go to the hospital for observation, that hypothermia could have delayed effects, and I might have other injuries I wasn't aware of yet. I told him I was fine, but he was insistent, and the trooper backed him up, saying I'd need medical clearance anyway for the investigation. I let them load me into an ambulance, too tired to argue anymore. As we pulled away, I saw them bringing up the bodies, black bags on stretchers, and I had to close my eyes. At the hospital, they put me in the ER and ran tests, checking my core temperature, doing an EKG, x-raying my ribs where I'd hit something on the way down the slope. Nothing was broken. I had mild hypothermia, the cut on my arm that needed 12 stitches, various bruises and scrapes. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation, but I refused, signing papers that said I was leaving against medical advice. My sister showed up around 7, her face pale when she saw me in the hospital bed, and she drove me back to get my truck from the shoulder of Route 81. The drive home was quiet. She kept looking over at me like she wanted to say something but didn't know what. When we got to my truck, the scene was cleared except for temporary barriers around the broken guardrail. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the highway. My sister hugged me before I got out, holding on longer than usual, and I could feel her shaking. I told her I was okay, that I'd call her tomorrow, and she made me promise 3 times before she'd let me drive away. I got home around 9 and stood in my driveway for a long time before going inside. My clothes were still damp, stiff with dried mud and creek water, and I could smell the wet earth and rust scent of blood. I stripped in the laundry room and stood in the shower until the water ran cold, watching brown and red circle the drain. When I finally got out and looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. There were scratches across my face from the bushes on the slope, a bruise forming on my jaw, my eyes red and hollow. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the Subaru spinning through the air, kept hearing that little girl crying for her mama, kept feeling the boy's dead weight as I dragged him from the water. Around midnight, I gave up and went downstairs, made coffee I didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table with my phone. I looked up the Ashford family, found Jeffrey's LinkedIn profile, pharmaceutical sales manager, smiling in a suit, Diana's Facebook page, full of pictures of the kids, family vacations, normal life. The last post was from that morning, a photo of Nathan in his Little League uniform, Diana commenting about being proud of her baseball star. 6 hours ago, she'd been alive, planning dinner, thinking about her son's game. Now Jeffrey was dead, and she was on life support, and I couldn't stop thinking about whether those extra minutes had mattered. The next morning, I went to the state police barracks like the trooper had asked. They had me sit in a small interview room with a camera in the corner, and 2 investigators came in with a recording device and more questions. They wanted every detail of the 911 calls, exactly what each dispatcher had said, how long before I went down the slope myself. One of them, a woman named Detective Pierce, kept circling back to the delays, asking me to be specific about timing. I told her everything I could remember. The first dispatcher not believing me, the second one mentioning the camera glitch, the 15 to 20-minute wait time I was given, how I'd gone down myself because I knew people were dying while we argued about whether it was real. Detective Pierce left the room and came back with a laptop. She turned it toward me and showed me the 911 call logs from yesterday afternoon. 3 calls from my number, time-stamped at 3:47, 3:52, and 4:03. Next to each one was a status code. The first 2 were marked as unverified and low priority. The third one, when I'd called after pulling the kids out, was marked urgent and units dispatched. She asked me to confirm that timeline, and I did. Then she showed me the highway camera footage, or the lack of it. 8 minutes of corrupted data, just a black screen with a timestamp covering 3:45 to 3:53. The accident had happened at 3:46. The other investigator, a heavy-set man with gray hair, asked me if I'd be willing to testify about the dispatcher interactions if it came to that. I asked what he meant, and Detective Pierce explained that they were conducting a review of the 911 system response, that there were serious questions about the verification procedures and how the camera glitch had affected the emergency response. She said the delays had likely cost Jeffrey Ashford his life, and possibly Diana's as well if she didn't recover. I told them I'd testify to whatever they needed, that someone should be held accountable for leaving those people to drown while they worried about camera footage. 2 days later, Diana Ashford died without regaining consciousness. I read it in the newspaper, a short article about the accident, describing how a family vehicle had left the highway and plunged into a ravine, killing both parents. It mentioned an unidentified motorist who had rescued the 2 children. The newspaper didn't mention the 911 delays, the dispatcher who thought I was lying, the 17 minutes between the accident and when help actually arrived. I sat at my kitchen table with that newspaper article and felt something cold settle in my chest, something that felt like rage, but quieter, deeper. The state police called 3 days after that and asked me to come back to the barracks. When I arrived, Detective Pierce took me to a conference room where a thin man in an expensive suit was waiting. He introduced himself as Nathan Reese, attorney for the Ashford family estate, representing the children's interests. He wanted to hear my account of the accident and the 911 calls, and he recorded everything on his phone while Pierce sat there taking notes. When I finished, Reese asked me if I'd be willing to give a deposition for a civil lawsuit they were filing against the county 911 system and the state highway department. I agreed immediately. The deposition happened 2 weeks later at Reese's office downtown. They had a court reporter and everything, me sitting at a conference table answering questions for 3 hours while lawyers from the county tried to poke holes in my story. They suggested maybe I'd been distracted while driving, maybe I'd seen the accident happen later than I remembered. Maybe the timeline wasn't as clear as I thought. They brought up the camera glitch like it was somehow my fault, suggested that without footage there was no way to verify exactly when the car went over. I kept my answers calm and factual, sticking to what I knew, what I'd seen, what I'd been told by the dispatchers. The county's lawyers requested my phone records and got them, showing the exact timestamps of my calls. They tried to argue that the first dispatcher had followed protocol by checking available resources before dispatching units, that the camera glitch was an equipment failure no one could have prevented. Reese countered with training documents, showing that dispatchers were supposed to send units immediately to any report of a serious accident with injuries, regardless of camera verification. He had communication logs showing other units had been available within 6 minutes of my first call, but hadn't been dispatched for 19 minutes because the call was marked low priority. The lawsuit dragged on for months. I had to testify twice more, once at a preliminary hearing and once in front of a grand jury that was investigating potential criminal negligence. The first dispatcher I talked to, a woman named Carol Hoffman, was placed on administrative leave. The county tried to settle quietly, but Reese refused, saying this wasn't about money, but about making sure the same failures didn't kill someone else's parents. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly I was getting calls from reporters, requests for interviews, people wanting me to talk about those 17 minutes. I did one interview with a reporter from the Harrisburg paper who'd been covering the lawsuit. I told her about standing on that shoulder watching the clock tick while the dispatcher questioned whether I was drunk, about going down that slope myself because no one was coming, about pulling those kids from the water while their parents drowned 20 feet away. The article ran on the front page with the headline, "System Failure, How 911 Delays Cost 2 Lives." The county administration put out a statement saying they were reviewing their procedures and retraining all dispatch personnel. 8 months after the accident, the county settled the lawsuit for $3.2 million, placed into trust funds for Lily and Nathan Ashford. Carol Hoffman was fired, along with her supervisor who had approved the low priority designation. The 911 system implemented new protocols requiring immediate dispatch to any traffic accident report, regardless of camera verification. The highway department installed backup cameras with redundant systems at all major ravine crossings. At the settlement announcement, Reese said that Jeffrey and Diana Ashford were still dead, but at least their children would be provided for, and maybe, hopefully, the changes would prevent the next family from dying while dispatchers argued about whether an accident was real. I went to see Nathan and Lily once, about a year after the accident. They were living with Diana's sister in Lancaster, a nice house with a big yard. Nathan was playing baseball in the driveway when I arrived, and when his aunt introduced me as the man who pulled them from the creek, he just looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Thank you," in this quiet, serious voice that sounded too old for a 9-year-old. Lily didn't really remember me, or said she didn't, but she gave me a picture she'd drawn of a rainbow and told me her mom was in heaven. I left after 20 minutes because I didn't know what else to say to children who'd lost everything while I'd stood on a highway shoulder arguing with someone who thought I was lying. I still drive Route 81 when I visit my sister. The guardrail has been replaced, stronger now, with warning signs posted about the curve. Sometimes I slow down when I pass mile marker 167 and look at the ravine. Remember the sound of that car hitting the water, the feel of those kids in my arms, the 17 minutes that turned a rescue into a recovery. The nightmares have mostly stopped, and the anger has dulled into something heavier that I carry without thinking about it most days. But every time I hear a siren, I wonder if the person on the other end of that 911 call is being believed. And I hope to God the changes we forced them to make actually matter when the next person calls screaming that someone's dying and needs help right now. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.